So welcome to our Christmas special of this B2B mediation practice community. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming two professors of dispute resolution, Cheryl Hayes and Noam Ebner, who will bring to us something really interesting on Star Wars and conflict resolution. When we first discussed this idea, we immediately bonded around the idea, and I think it's really nice to see which richness is in that topic. And so we're very pleased, together with Beatrice, to welcome you to share your insights into what links and parallels can be drawn from Star Wars and conflict resolution. And the floor is yours, Noam and Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean-Christophe, and thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to your network, to sharing space and time with you, particularly when it's about something that that we love so much. I know this isn't your run-of-the-mill webinar about mediation or conflict resolution, but on the other hand, we think that it's really helpful to think about the work that we do through other perspectives other than sort of, get up in the morning, go to work and do the work itself. Looking at it from other perspectives, some of those in a galaxy far, far away, can be really helpful. Excuse me, that kind of morning. But before we go to that galaxy far, far away, I'd like to introduce ourselves, just so you know that we're not just a couple of Star Wars nerds coming to talk about Star Wars, but we've actually done a thing or two around a conflict room. So how about if we introduce ourselves briefly? Cheryl, you want to jump in and say what you're bringing to the table? Before
I can. Yeah. Well, I've actually got two lightsabers behind me. I'm happily.
I know.
So I'm Cheryl Hayes. I'm currently a professor of conflict management at Kennesaw State University, which is just north of Atlanta, Georgia. You've probably heard of Atlanta, but not Kennesaw. So I started working first as a family mediator. It was nice to hear some family mediators on here in 1999. I moved to the UK in 2000, where I did my PhD at Newcastle University, as well as practiced as a family mediator in England, Wales, and completed my qualifications to work in Scotland as well. Then moved back to the United States, worked in the court system in North Carolina as a custody and visitation mediator, and then got sideways dragged into parenting coordination, which is kind of a third-party MEAD-ARB hybrid, where you work with parents in a more detailed way than we usually work in mediation. And then I went to University of North Carolina at Greensboro as a professor there. And when you're conflict resolution professor, you tend to get dragged into all sorts of things. Greensboro is a refugee resettlement city, and we found that there were lots of community-based conflicts between different cultural groups. And so I worked with students there for about 9 years on community-based conflicts as well. Then moved to Kennesaw State, continued that work, and then got dragged once again into a whole new world for me, which was family businesses. So I heard some people talking about family enterprise. I worked for 6 years with two colleagues here, one originally from Italy, Guy Marchisio, who's a sort of an internationally known person who works in family business disputes. And so I did that for several years, working with a team, a multidisciplinary team, Guy as a business expert, me as the conflict person, and then Marjorie, who was our actually family therapist. And so we worked as a team with family business disputes. I was then dragged into academic administration, where I now practice conflict management skills as a school director, which is sort of a department chair, and still do some conflict work. I do arbitration, small matters arbitrations for Better Business Bureau, and occasionally do some family work. So, when you work in conflict management, you get dragged into all sorts of interesting areas. So it's nice to not just be a scholar of the work, but also still be able to do some practice as well.
Thanks. And I really, mainly along those same years that Cheryl has gone through also. I've been in mediation since 1999. I started out intending to be a lawyer, and as I just told Jean-Christophe before we started, I got dragged into a mediation course by accident, and I never looked back. I was studying law and living in Israel at the time, so I practiced mediation in Israel for many years. Mediation was just getting started there, so my preferred sort of area of mediation was anything I can. So basically, that covers just about literally every type of mediation that that all of you have mentioned. Not necessarily specializing as deeply as I know all of you probably have, but it means that I've dipped my toe into many pools. And after a while of doing that, I started getting into the academic side of things. And I was particularly interested, I was always particularly interested ever since Help Me Obi-Wan Kenobi, You're My Only Hope. And living across two countries, I'm originally from the United States and I was living in Israel. So the notion of communication at a distance and how it changes human interactions always fascinated me. So I started getting into, I'm not a techie, but I started getting into online communication relatively early, and then online conflict. And how do we resolve online conflict, and how do we resolve conflict online? So I've also been working in the area of online dispute resolution for a long time, way before it became popular or unpopular over the past 3-4 years. And in 2009, Creighton University wanted to open an online master's in dispute resolution, and suddenly realized that they had a lot of people who wanted to study that online, because let's face it, Creighton University, just like Cheryl said, it's in Omaha, Nebraska. Some of you might know where Nebraska is.
It's the geographic center of the state.
That's right.
Strategic Air Command.
Oh, a dart. I was just throwing a dart, right?
Throwing a dart in the middle of the country.
If you hit the bullseye. But other than that, there's not much to bring students there. So people started asking, hey, I'd love to study this material, but Omaha. So they decided to open an online program, but didn't quite know sort of how to do that in practice. And somehow we met and merged, and it was a very good marriage for both of us. So I managed that program for several years, and now I've backed away from any administration side, going the opposite route of Cheryl, and now I am just a professor of conflict resolution at Creighton. And leading us into the next part of this topic is, ever since I took my first mediation course, I said to myself, boy, it would be great to write something about Star Wars and conflict. Because Star Wars is all about conflict, and I'll get to that in a moment. But as I got into academia, I recognized that might be something that it's better to do after you have tenure than before you have tenure, in the sense of having the freedom of time and thought, and also not having people look at you and raise their eyebrow at, are we actually paying you to do that? So yeah, first of all, it turns out that yes, it's part of my day job now. But it's also a part of sort of seeing everything going on in the world through these conflict perspectives that we all have. I know many of you can't watch a movie without wanting to yank out a legal pad and writing notes about how this character or that character were negotiating, or they were positional, or did something interest-based and brilliant. So this was just taking it to the next level. And here's the purpose. Here's the purpose of this all. When Star Wars came out in 1977, I was 4 years old. And for some reason that I don't quite know, my father took me and my brother to the movie, and we saw it. And then we saw it again that summer. I know that we saw it twice, because my earliest memory of Star Wars is hiding behind a chair, behind the seat in front of me in the movie theater, because I knew that Darth Vader was about to walk on screen. So I had to know that he was about to come. So it had to be the second viewing. And he was, of course, the scariest thing in the world. And to that extent, Star Wars is part of my earliest memories. And as the years have gone by, it's become sort of a background story in my own life. much as, you know, pick your own favorite saga series. It could be books, it could be, you know, stories, tales, whatever it is that you've grown up alongside. And it's just been a reference point throughout my entire life. As I got deeper and deeper into conflict, you know, I also wanted to work and play with that, because it makes my life more congruent to be working with materials that I love. But at some point along my career, I also started thinking about, hey, you know, we're working in negotiation and mediation, both in practice and as teachers. How often do we say to ourselves the following thing? Everybody should know some of this, right? I mean, that's it's just like it's a chorus that we say to ourselves all the time. And I think that everybody in this room has found a way to teach some of what you know, right? Pass on what you have learned, as Yoda says, right? So whether you've shared it in your environment or told people, or actually done any number of just goodwill informational talks in schools, or to bar associations, or to commerce guilds, or whatever it is, just giving the talk on mediation and why it might be beneficial. Everyone here has probably done one, some of you might have done 100. And it's always with everyone should know some of this, because if everyone knew some of this, everyone would get along maybe just a little bit better. I'm not saying world peace. I'm not saying world peace, okay? But just a little better. And not only that, but the more people knew about this, and when I say people, I really mean everybody. If they knew a little bit more, then they might be a little better at handling their disputes themselves. They might be more prone to come to us as mediators rather than take their cases automatically to court, even when they're managing businesses, right? Because they know a little bit more about that ahead of time. And when we finally get them in the room, we might discover that it's easier to work with them because they have some basic knowledge of this, not necessarily that they've read all of the books that we've read or taken the courses we've read, but their conflict, what we call conflict fluency, their ability to sort of read and recognize and make choices in conflict is just a little more enhanced because they've learned some of that. And when you think about how everyone could use some of that, and when I think about how I teach, you know, maybe 100 graduate students a year. And in periods when I'm doing training, so maybe I train like, you know, when I'm really busy, maybe I've trained like 1,000 people in a year, let's say, right? Maybe. That's just a drop in the water, a drop in the bucket of everybody who needs to know this. So I've been looking for ways to teach this at scale, not deep teaching, but like public education at scale. And so one of the things that I considered doing, and here's where I met my partner, who was unable to join us today for personal reasons, and it's Tara, because she's such a lovely person and would have explained all this much better than I'm doing, and also probably much shorter than I'm doing. But the point is that we figured that you know, we don't have thousands and millions of students, but there are some things out there that have hundreds of thousands and millions of followers. And those are pop culture artifacts, pop culture phenomena that have like a built-in audience of millions or hundreds of millions of people. And I did some research, and I discovered that when you know, I naturally started with Star Wars and discovered that 75% of US adults over 18 have watched at least one movie of Star Wars. In fact, my one claim to fame is that I was unable to find any details on this. So I poked a statistics gathering firm and asked them about this until they just they said, oh, that's a good question. And they went and surveyed. And 75%, and that, you know, so they're not all, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, that doesn't mean that everybody's an 11 Star Wars fan. It might mean that, but there are many that are a 2 to 4, have seen a movie or 3, and can sort of relate to some of the frames, some of the iconic scenes, some of the main characters. Whoa, and that's enough. So if we can, I call this sort of hitching the wagon of mediation and conflict resolution to the engine of Star Wars, and maybe later on to other engines, right? Whatever, it might be It might be Shakespeare, it might be Harry Potter, it might be Star Trek, whatever it is, it might be Doctor Who, whatever, name your favorite cultural or pop cultural thingy. And that might be a next project or a next project. But this is our first introduction into the show. You wanna jump in?
No, I was just going to say, you were naming all those other things. You're just going down my list, right? Harry Potter, Dr. It's easy to be, that's the thing. It's easy to be a fan, yeah. and to the conversation you and I've had going back years on this. So I wrote a piece for Mediate.com in 2008 or 2009, just about things I had learned that I was using in my own practice, and then in my early, sort of nascent days as an academic. And just threw it out there, and I still think it's probably one of the most well-read things I've ever written, despite all of my other efforts for the last 20 years to publish something academic that caught on. So when I heard about this project, I was like, oh, absolutely, let's jump in on this, because there is such a sort of a natural flow for those of us that have grown up with it. But now we're on really three generations of people that have some sort of connection to Star Wars, whether you were a parent that took your children to see it when they were young, or as a parent, I've taken my children to see the new trilogies, and now the shows that are on. I mean, Disney has really done us a favor in terms of the marketing Star Wars as a conflict resolution tool, because they're doing such a great job of making sure that it carries on the legacy and the universe and the things people understand about it. So I don't see something like this. I see it having long legs, as long as we can figure out how to capture not just the energy, but the interesting connections that we've made in our heads as conflict resolution mediation professionals to the things we've seen in these films. One of the ways I got the job here at Kennesaw is my job talk was all about Jedi mediation, and wow, it's really interesting. The students are going to love that, and that was 11 years.
So you two mediation, I'll call it now ninjas, to just take another word. Once you had figured out what movie you were going to base the story on for the storytelling, how did you then scale this idea and deploy and build an alliance for that? I'd be interested to learn a bit about the context. How big has this thing grown today? Because you've already, if I'm not mistaken, created books or other infographics around that. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, and let me jump in on this, and I'll keep it
project. Yeah,
I'll keep it sort of brief, because I could talk about this all day. This has been my life for the past 4 years, or rather, this has been the part of my life that has been bringing me joy throughout a very rough time in all of our lives. But I won't talk about it all day. But I will say this: when Jen and I decided that we were going to do this, we could have sat down and written a book, based on just our own insights. But we decided two things. One is that wouldn't be nearly as fun as gathering together a group of friends to do it. And two, it wouldn't be as interesting, because it would all be coming from us. And there are 1,000 ways to see these movies and think about conflict. And three is that the more people we brought in, the more chances we were giving this project and future projects a chance of spreading. And here, when I say spreading, I don't, as Cheryl said, it's kind of a cool idea, and like a university can get excited of having a faculty member. Oh, yeah, that sounds cool. Students might think, hey, that's cool. But our real purpose here is to break the wall of academic writing and to send this out into the general public. And to do that, just like any Rebel Alliance, you need a lot of partners. And the more partners you have, the better. This is not about us. This is about, there's a mission here. No one can overthrow the empire by themselves, right? That's the lesson of Star Wars. And just to give it a little background, Star Wars has been, it's been developing over the past 45 years with first one movie and then 3 movies, which is the first trilogy. And then they put out a prequel trilogy of the events before that, and then a sequel trilogy of later events. And in the past few years, there have been live action TV shows, and there are also hundreds of books and comic books and video games expanding all of this universe. So there's no end of material. And one thing that means is that none of us can be expert in all of it. And we all bring sort of different corners of it. So our first project and the first way we approached it was to put out a call for paper, inviting everybody who would like to be in this, to be in it with us. And the amazing thing is that we were bowled over by the amount of people who signed up for the Alliance.
Yeah.
Within weeks. Dozens and dozens of people, and that's how I mean we'd known Cheryl and known of Cheryl beforehand, and his article in Mediate.com is like one of the only things out there that use the word Star Wars and negotiation in the same thing. Nobody has written about this other than Cheryl and just a couple of other sort of small blog pieces, but they all came, and we were flooded with chapter proposals for this. And in the end, to make a long story short, the hardest part of this project was deciding what would go in this first book. That was the hardest part of it, because there were so many wonderful ideas, and it was just what would make for a good first book. And indeed, I get to push this next button and show you that this is I had hoped that we were this close to be announcing, to doing a worldwide premiere of the book, going live at Amazon this evening, where you are, here with you. At the last moment, of course, as often happens, there was a last moment hiccup. So it's not up on Amazon yet. It will be soon, and I will, with your permission, I'll send that to you, Beatrice Jean-Christophe. I will send it, and if you could, post it and share it. We're talking hopefully days, a week. The point was to have it out by in time for people to buy it as Christmas gifts, because I think, I've been trying to explain what the heck do you do to my family for 2 decades. They say, wait, I don't know what you do. You're some kind of a lawyer, but no, not really, right? And I say, yeah. And they say, but what exactly do you do? And I say, well, I explained that to you, last Christmas or last Hanukkah in my case, right? And you don't get it, do you? So let me explain again. And this is really a book that I'm going to be giving to people in my closest family, and tell them, hey, this is what I work with. This is my toolbox. This is what I do. Apparently you don't understand it when I give real life examples. Let me talk Star Wars to you. And there's a Star Wars person in everybody's life who will benefit from that. Cheryl, do you want to add something, and then we'll just jump in?
The cover is just so fantastic. I can't wait to hold it in my hands. And it's a labor of love. I mean, in fact, I think the original call for proposals, it was like, join the Rebel Alliance. I'm like, I've been waiting for this my whole life.
Yes.
It was just one of those great moments. I think we've all felt that as conflict resolution practitioners. You kind of, when you meet people, you go to a conference or a workshop or a group like this, you kind of find your tribe, right? And the people that you don't have to explain yourself to. This is what the authorship of this book was like. I just didn't have to explain myself to these folks. I hope that translates into what we've written. I know. It was said very well. The bridge here for us is making sure this isn't an academic book, that this really is a book that's accessible. In fact, when I was writing drafts of the chapter, I gave it to my then 12-year-old son, who's now 14, and said, Sam, does this make sense to you? And he reads it and he's like, yeah, I get it, right? And I give it to my daughter, who's 2 years older and not as interested in Star Wars as her brother. And she's like, yeah, I think I understand this. If I can make 2 teenagers get what we're trying to accomplish, then maybe there's hope from the universe. But of course, they've also been raised by a Star Wars nerd professor dad, so maybe there's
that helps. But I think the vulgarizing it like you do and visualizing these things, and I'm just fascinated by the Dark Star right? That or
The
what
Death Star, yeah.
The Death Star, yeah.
Death Star, yes. And then the opposites here cooperate and compete and compromise and avoid and accommodate. This is beautiful because you're using the design language of these iconic things that you recognize, and you're adding a bit of context to this. So I'm really curious now how you combine it with the dispute resolution techniques, and especially with mediation, because this is the B2B group for mediation.
Thank you
Yeah.
for moving us forward. And here is
Yeah.
how we're going to do that. So as Cheryl said, you don't need to be a Star Wars nerd third degree in order to be able to think about Star Wars a little and recognize that there's a lot of conflict in Star Wars. It's literally in the name, right? And most of the visual conflict that you see is, it's very visual in the sort of iconic lightsabers clashing, force energy, Death Stars blowing up. But as conflict resolution professionals, the really interesting parts of Star Wars are often the conversations, right? They're negotiations. They're the things that people say to each other while they're swinging lightsabers at each other. The ways they try to persuade and convince and affect each other on psychological levels, on persuasive levels, how they try to achieve their goals, whether they're achieving them through violence, which is one area of conflict and conflict resolution, and whether they're trying to approach it through alternative nonviolent methods such as persuasion, which is more on the negotiation, mediation-y side of things. But here's the thing, while lightsabers go over really well on screen, like sitting down to watch a long, protracted, drawn-out mediation conversation, not so much. It just doesn't go over well. And that's why it's called Star Wars. It's not called Star Mediation, Star Communicative Facilitated Conversation Seeking Integrative Outcomes. It's not, right? So interesting how in the movies themselves, there are no flat out good examples of mediation. On the other hand, the Jedi, who are the main protagonists of the show, their role are peacekeepers and peacemakers. Their job is to bring peace and justice to the galaxy. And indeed, in some of the Star Wars, particularly in the books, there are books in which discussions of the mediator role is just as developed as any textbook on mediation. Sometimes it boggles my mind. And yet it's all written in Star Wars. In a way, even more than we've done here. In other words, there are Star Wars novels that have characters mediating, and they have characters being parties in informal mediations. You don't see that so much in the movies. There are isolated scenes. There's more and more in the later shows, like in The Mandalorian. There are good moments where you actually see it happening. In the original movies, let's jump into the first sort of, maybe some of you will remember this scene. This is the first time we meet the Imperials, the bad guys. And we see Vader for the first time doing his force choke, being able to choke people from a distance. And then we have this Governor Tarkin who steps in. He's the first third-party step-in that we see in Star Wars. And really all that he does is to end the immediate conflict. And it's easiest to notice mediation in this scene for the lack thereof. There was a real conflict going on beyond over there. No need to get into all the details of the scene, but the question is, what will serve the Empire better? Will it be military force, or will it be belief in the Force, right? This mystic power that Darth Vader controls and that the Jedi control. So there are different interests in these scenes. There are characters applying different types of power. There's a lot to talk about from a conflict resolution perspective. And instead, the person who steps in just tries to break up the moment and end the conflict separate parties, but not do anything constructive with what they have. So there's a lot to talk about what didn't happen. So we don't
Right.
have much. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say, and in fact, his Tarkin's sort of final word on this is basically this bickering is pointless.
Right.
And we've all, and especially I imagine those of us that have worked with family disputes, if you've had a family group meeting where you've had all multi-generations around the table trying to have a large discussion about what to do with the family-owned business, you've seen somebody, whether it's the patriarch of the family or the current CEO of the company or whatever, have to do this very thing where they just stop the meeting. This bickering is pointless. And then the discussion ends. And to Noam's point, it's never productive, right? It stops the behavior in the moment, but often what happens is then people sit back and they get, their brain gets occupied with other things, right? So you haven't moved the conversation forward. And that's but it's a very real scenario, I think, that we've all seen. And I watched that scene in Star Wars. My brain goes to family group meetings, faculty meetings for that. There's all these moments. It's a great example. It's a short example, but it's a good one.
And it goes right back to that moment of some of you, maybe all of you are familiar. This is one of the, the tribe always tells this story of the two girls in the orange, right? The two girls who are dividing the orange and they don't know what to do. One wants, and so they go to their mom, and their mom takes a knife and splits the orange and says, "Here, you take half and you take half." And essentially what she's doing is she just wants them to stop fighting. So she finds the easy solution. And sort of this is the point where sort of the communicative dynamic that Cheryl described is joined with how we actually reach solutions. Those the actual outcomes are also pinned to that fundamental desire to let's just stop the bickering. And of course, in the story that we tell, we all know that in the end, if it turns out that Sarah needed the orange to, for
juice.
For juice, and
yeah, one wanted juice and one wanted the rind.
In order to grate into the chocolate she was making, then an interest-based conversation would have gone really well here. But instead, they're each left with half of what they could have gotten out of the situation. So there's a world, our worlds, it might be a galaxy far away, but the worlds are very close. And there are so many concepts that are useful for the mediation room that are everywhere in Star Wars. I could take any negotiation textbook and talk about any concept in a Star Wars scene. I could take, whatever the most common, like I could take every line in Getting to Yes and point to a Star Wars scene that exemplifies it and brings it to life. Sometimes in a really interesting way that the authors of Getting to Yes haven't thought about, which is another facet of this project, is that because we're thinking about these things in another galaxy and on another set of examples, people are coming up with original conflict ideas, not just original Star Wars ideas, but original ideas about conflict. But that's a talk for another day, or that's something that you can see. If you read the book, you will definitely find things there that are not in your mediation textbook, but they will be very helpful in the room. But for today, we just want to point at 3 topics that are incredibly helpful in the mediation room, and Star Wars brings them to life in a very helpful way. And those 3 are things that probably most of you are familiar with, 1 or 2 or all of them. The third is possibly the least well-known thing. It'll be more familiar when I describe it. So the first is the notion of conflict styles. Let's just jump into it in order not to give pre-explanations of what it is. So the notion of conflict styles is that every one of us has sort of an innate approach, default mode that we default to whenever we find ourselves in conflict. It's not something up here, it's something down here, right? Or something here in the back of our mind. And it's developed at a very early age. And I think that just intuitively, if you think about yourself, and how you feel when you find yourself in a conflict situation, are you energized and excited to go fight the other person? Or do you just wish it would be over with? Or do you find yourself wanting to give the other whatever they asked for. I'm not saying what you think is the right thing to do at the moment. I'm saying what's your instinct. And it's well accepted in the conflict theory world, although it's also debated. But it's an interesting debate of whether we have this default mode. And some of you might be familiar with the Thomas Kilmann instrument, and there are other models of how these different conflict modes are. And the notion of a conflict style is something that each one of us has, is something that it's worth exploring for ourselves. So let's jump in, and I'll explain conflict styles, and we'll explain doing that by throwing it at Star Wars characters and trying to identify what we think their conflict modes are. And please feel welcome either to jump in or to just write down in the chat, because it's really easy to debate. You know,
it's fun too.
Right, that's part of the reason to do it in Star Wars, because if you tell me that your conflict style is, let's say that you're cooperative in conflict, I'm not going to argue with you. But if you tell me that you think one Star Wars character is because you've seen them in this scene, then Cheryl might say, yeah, but what about in that other scene? And then you start a conversation that leads to really thinking about conflict styles. So the notion of conflict styles is one way to map it out, is that we think about two things. Our brain instantly thinks about two things. Do we look at what we need and matching our own needs? Or do we also have a side of us that wants to make the other happy and wants to provide their needs? And when you put that on a chart, which is one way that academics can make anything sound academic, is you just draw this and throw
put it on an x-axis and a y-axis, right?
That's it. I've given the magic away, and now now we'll be kicked out of the professoriate. So if you look at how sharply my instinct takes me to getting my own needs met, and how sharply my instinct takes me to either helping the other meet their needs or to preserving our relationship in one vague way, then you come up with four primary conflict modes. There are others you could discuss, but it's basically talking about some people's primary mode is competing. I try to get my own needs met, and I don't care about the other party too much. So I'm primarily interested in myself. And the flip side of that is accommodating. I tend to put my own needs aside, and I just try and make the other person happy. A third is I just want to avoid the situation. I forget about anything I need, and I just want to get away from the situation, even if it means I'm not making the other person happy, you're not providing them what they need. I might not care about them too much, but I don't want to fight for what's mine. I just want this all to end, so I avoid the conflict. And then there's the cooperation instinct, which is like I don't want to forego my own needs. But I do want to either grow our relationship or make sure the relationship doesn't suffer. And I have this natural tendency to take the other into account, the other and their needs. And what's really tough here is that we're talking about, when I say these are natural default orientations and that they're back here, it means that they're irrational, they're default, they're instinct. And yet we're using very rational terms to describe them. And that's something challenging. It's as if we're thinking, well, our relationship is important, so I'll try to help. We're not at that level yet. We'll talk about that level later. But right now we're talking, who is cooperative by default? Who is accommodating by default? And let's jump this into Star Wars. And we're going to start with competitive, because naturally Star Wars, as you know, as an action movie in the end, an action-packed movie, basically based on Westerns, right? Western films. There's a lot more competition than there is cooperation. So who would you say, just if we could open the chat for a moment before we throw in our examples, does anyone want to toss in their example of a competitive person in Star Wars, person or being?
I think George Harrison, what's his name? His character. He's like super competitive, also with the.
I know. I think you mean
Harrison Ford, like Han Solo.
Okay, sorry.
Han Solo.
You see,
exactly-
my Star Wars expertise is very limited.
But
he's
you
the
managed to
main character.
communicate, and that's fine.
Yeah. So and you see that at different levels when he and Princess, was it Leia? I
Yes,
don't-
Yeah.
Yeah, right. This is sort of interesting tension, a relationship there, and they get aggravated when things are being said, and yet even the biggest competitors end up teaming up at some point, right?
Right. Right. And Beatrice also said Han Solo. Cheryl, you want to weigh in on
Yeah,
that?
exactly.
No, I mean, I think Han Solo is a good example. I mean, and it's as most competitive or many competitive people are, when something doesn't go their way, there's always a reason why it's not their fault. I mean, that's one of Han's that comes up. Oh, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. You know, it's not my fault, right? Because they're so laser focused on what it is they want to do. They're really not paying attention to what else is going on, except when, of course, it goes wrong. So, yeah, that's it's a good example.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you mention Princess Leia and Han, it's important to jump straight ahead and say there's nothing judgmental in our saying that someone is a competitive by nature, and it doesn't necessarily lessen their chances in the end of under the right circumstances reaching agreements with other people or working with other people. But when they're working on it by their instinct, they're more likely to encounter fighting along the way. And some of you, I'm sure, know couples who, like Han Solo and Princess Leia, their relationship is foundationally built on their competitive instincts. Later on earlier on, really, for those who have watched the movies, know that there's another couple whose romantic potential is at least in one of the parties manifested in his fiercely competitive nature. In other words, he's competitive in love, and that is, just to jump us ahead.
Yes.
Probably the most competitive person in Star Wars. Is this guy, Cheryl?
Yeah, Anakin Skywalker, who becomes Darth Vader.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, he's this quote comes from a scene after he's already made the transition from Anakin to Darth Vader, when he is talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Obi-Wan is trying to find out what happened. What happened to you? Why have you turned to the dark side? And he comes out with this statement, you know, if you're not with me, you're my enemy. That's that kind of singular thinking, that sort of myopic view, that's something that is characteristic of this very competitive style. I mean, you mentioned the relationship, you know, earlier. Padme's relationship with Anakin is one that has to be secret, because Jedi aren't supposed to form close, loving relationships like this. And Padme is a senator, and so she has to maintain some objectivity away from the Jedi. But he's always trying to win, right? And we see this in Anakin as a characteristic that continues through his life, and, you know, also Darth Vader, that winning is the most important thing, and irrespective of everything else. No, his relationship to Obi-Wan, his relationship to Padme, even for a long time, his relationship with Luke, winning is the key thing. And this is one of those things he doesn't consider. In fact, it takes until the end of episode 6 of Return of the Jedi for him to be on the verge of death to go, maybe Ellis winning wasn't really winning.
Right.
It took a strong moment of reflection.
Yeah. And before we go on, I'd like to take one step back, because so we've given an example of recognizing an instinctively competitive person. And I'd like to take this moment to explain for a second why this is helpful, and why this is helpful for us in the room. So of course, you know, I think I don't need to elaborate on why it's helpful to know our own intuitive styles as negotiators or people in conflict, because it'll enable us to work with our strengths and to shut down certain instinctive behavior when it's not helpful. But when you're thinking about identifying it in other people, And that's what Star Wars is really helpful for. And once you do it in Star Wars, it's also just people watching is really helpful for this, is because when you learn to sit in a room with with people, and then in 10 minutes able to at least put an initial tentative label on them and say, this seems to me to be a competitive person, this seems to me to be an accommodative person, it helps us to anticipate what their reactions to different situations might be. So it helps us to anticipate how they might behave to something we might say. It also helps us to anticipate how they might respond to something the other party might say. That other something might be an aggressive move by the other party. It might also be a settlement proposal from the other party. You know, when we think about is a settlement proposal good or bad, to the extent that we think about that at all, one thing that's always on our mind is how is the other person going to relate to that? And one solid answer to how the other person is going to relate to that is the other person is first of all going to relate to that through their instinctive behavior. And if we've recognized them as a fiercely competitive instinctive behavior, then we should be aware that there's a very good chance that their first instinct to any proposal might be a competitive response to that proposal. And that's really helpful when we're thinking as mediators as to, okay, so, and when that happens, what are we going to do? Okay, that's just an example. A second reason for why this is helpful is because, as we've mentioned, some of you mentioned, one of you mentioned that you're doing more work with counseling or coaching now out of the room than you are in the room. So it's really helpful for coaching parties, particularly whether you're outside of the mediation and just working with as a negotiation coach or a conflict coach, or if you're working with parties in separate sessions and caucusing, and you're trying to help them figure out what their next moves would be. Knowing what their conflict style is will really help you work with them, because it'll help you to know when you suggest or they suggest anything, you'll know what sort of an effort it's likely to take from them to make that move, based on whether this is instinctive, intuitive, or counter-instinctive and counterintuitive. You'll know whether they'll be instinctively good at it or not. And that's in addition to knowing what the other will likely counter that with. So it's very helpful in separate sessions as well. Cheryl, you want to add on something?
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's the way I've used this is I try to think about the mix in the room, right? So if it's 2 parties or 4 parties or 6 parties, if you've kind of got an idea of where people sit, you see, you know, one person is maybe a little bit more competitive, and you've got someone who's a little bit more avoidant, or you've got someone that's a little bit more compromising. It helps me maybe bring out some of the compromising person might have had a really good idea, but they're not going to rock the boat because they don't want to upset the competitive person. Well, the competitive person's now going to dominate this conversation. So part of my role now as mediator is to maybe turn down the competitive person just a little bit to make sure that we can amplify the voice of the competitive person and figure out how to draw the avoidant person in the room. A quick little funny story of mediating divorce mediation, 2 very competitive people. And one of the things I do when we listen to proposals, you probably do this as well, I just start writing things down, right? So one makes a proposal and I've got my legal pad, my sheet of paper, and on one line, somebody made a proposal and then the other person just rejects it. So, you know, it's a back and forth, it's a tit for tat. And I filled up an entire front sheet of legal pad, 36 lines, where I just crossed stuff out as they were just kind of going back and forth. And finally, I turned the sheet of paper around and showed it to them. And I said, I got nothing. These are 36 good ideas and you just turned them down. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you. And I just kind of laid it in the middle of the table. Well, because they had seen it. Oh, you know, this was a classic example of competition for competition's sake, right? They were trying to win and they were trying to point score rather than trying to come up with some sort of collaborative solution. When you said Han Solo earlier, I'm like, wow, Han and Leia fighting in the tunnels trying to get out of Hoth, right? That's that conversation, right? He's saying one thing, she's saying another thing, he's saying another thing. They both want to be right, while the Empire is blowing, literally the walls are falling in around them, and they're bickering back and forth purely for the sake of bickering. Wasn't accomplishing anything. So anyway.
And sometimes showing parties that mirror, and in such a delightfully framed way as you did that, Cheryl, is so helpful. So sometimes you're able to do that counseling that I suggested in separate rooms. Sometimes you can do it jointly in the same room. Let's move on to another form. And let me ask you this. So another form is, another conflict style is the style of accommodation, of just giving in to the other party. And I wonder if anyone can think of Star Wars characters who that's their tendency. They just give up. They face the conflict situation and they just give up. Chewie gives up. Beatrice, you want to share your thoughts on that?
Well, I think he's just whatever Han Solo says, he'll just do it, right? I mean, I'm not a big Star Wars fan, so it's been a while that I've seen it. But for me, he's the typical person, individual that says, yes, that's fine, okay, whichever. I'm not happy with it, but I'll still give in.
It's good.
I don't know if you agree.
I love it. I love
Yeah.
it. You're right. He just whatever Han wants, right?
And that's how he is. And this is an interesting distinction, that when people hear that, wait, does that mean we have one default style? No, but there are, sometimes I'm really different. And one thing people say is, for example, I'm one way at work and a really different way at home. So that's one question people often pose on this conflict, this notion of conflict styles. They say, no, I don't fit into any one box. That's wrong. And we're not here to sell that that's right or wrong. We just think it's a really interesting thing to think about and really helpful in conflict. And let me point out that what you just suggested is that you might consider that Chewie is that way in that one relationship, right? That's how he is with Han Solo. With everybody else, he can be very highly and instinctively competitive. But this is a great way to exemplify how you can talk about these things for hours. And as you talk about, you really start to get a different understanding of, so what does it mean to have a conflict style? It's not just understanding Chewbacca. No, it's understanding conflict styles. And then you're going to understand how the room works. Right.
Yeah, I love that example, because you think back to episode 4. So the first movie in our universe, chronologically, they're trying to break into the Death Star, right? They're sneaking in, and Luke's like, I've got an idea, and he grabs like handcuffs, they call them binders, and he starts to put them on Chewbacca, and Chewie growls at him like this terrifying growl, and he turns around and hands him to Han and says, why don't you do it? And then Han's like, I think I know where he's going here, buddy, and he puts the binders on. So in that moment, Luke, he was having nothing to do with Luke, and I would not have messed with an 8-foot Wookiee either. But because he trusted Han in this instance, he's like, okay, all right, whatever. If you think it's a good idea, I'll do it. This I'm not having it. So,
and let me jump in there just to say, excuse me. Many people have not seen this movie, and I don't want to spoil it. Okay, for those of you who enjoy Star Wars, and particularly if you've enjoyed the first original trilogy, and remember the Han Solo character, they made the last movie that was made in the Star Wars series it's called Solo, a Star Wars movie, and it's actually Han Solo's backstory, and it's also Chewbacca's backstory, and the way they meet, all that I will give away about this is the way they meet is they are meeting as two very instinctively competitive characters. And as they meet in a very competitive dog-eat-dog or man-eat Wookiee or Wookiee man situation, they need to change to something else. And in that changing to something else, they transform their relationship to exactly what Beatrice detailed it is. But it's an amazing scene that you can use in any conflict class that any of you train or teach or show your kids now. But I'm not going to give any more than that away. Go see them.
It is as good and as descriptive as you've and helpful as you've described. It is absolutely. You watch you actually can document the shift from competitive to collaborative,
right?
And it illustrates that purpose of getting your needs met, and caring and sort of doing the relationship. I'm moving along the axis if you can't tell.
Yeah, I see that.
Right. so, but that's the thing about both competitive and collaborative. It is both high on getting your needs met.
Right.
The difference is the strength of the relationship.
So if we continue with accommodating, there aren't many accommodators in Star Wars. So Beatrice correctly, there's this one relationship in which is an accommodator. But if Star Wars was about people giving up, it wouldn't, it wouldn't have lasted past the first movies. That doesn't capture our attention. There is one character in Star Wars who every so often decides, hey, I'm done with this.
Yeah, that's the two robots, right?
Right.
Yeah.
R2D2 and this one.
C-3PO, yeah, he is he is if there were, and now there is, a dictionary of conflict and Star Wars terms, accommodator would just be a picture of C-3PO.
Right. And interestingly, for what Jean-Christophe said, R2D2, if you remember the short blue and white sidekick, it's unclear who the sidekick and who the non-sidekick is. I like to think that they argue about that between them.
Yeah.
R2D2, even though we can't understand a word he says, if you watch him in the movies through a conflict styles lens, you're likely to reach the conclusion that he is fiercely competitive. He never gives in. C-3PO gives in all the time. It's sort of their fundamental programming, but we're going to leave that for you. Sort of go back and watch the movies. We could talk just about that. So another conflict style is the very basic. If we're looking at avoiding, who avoids conflict? Again, there aren't many examples. Because if this was about people avoiding conflict, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be such an action built. Thank you, Elodie. Thanks for spending time with us.
Yeah.
So can anyone who turns their back on conflict and walks away? I'm not surprised at the silence. We ourselves struggled to come up with an example, but there is one.
Maybe it's Luke's uncle, right? In the beginning where he grows up.
Yes.
Bingo.
Oh.
Absolutely bingo.
Wow.
That's the only one we could come up with. Do you want to elaborate on that, Beatrice?
Well, from what I remember, he's really, I mean, they are in their hut in the beginning or wherever they live in the desert, and then they have some discussions and he keeps kind of walking away and doing his work, and he just goes on and on with whatever he's doing at that moment in time. Is that right?
Yeah, bingo. And what he does it in an interesting way. He tells Luke what to do, right? He's gruff. He gives orders, but he gives orders in order to avoid the conflict or negotiation, right, Cheryl?
Yeah, no, and in fact, the quote we have on the screen here.
Yeah.
So this is Luke talking to Obi-Wan. I can't get involved. Obi-Wan's retort to this is, "That's your uncle talking." So I mean, even it's so ingrained in who he is because he's been raised by his uncle that his avoidance side, which maybe isn't Luke's default setting, but that avoidance has been trained into him through his life experience of being raised by his uncle.
Right, and if anyone who's seen the most recent the second to most recent Star Wars TV series on Disney Plus. Obi-Wan Kenobi and his backstory, there's this amazing moment where we see Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, who are taking care of Luke as a child on Tatooine, they suddenly realize that Luke is in danger, and Obi-Wan says, "We have to run." That's his instinctive response. And Aunt Beru's instinctive response is, "We're going to fight." And that's her instinct. And you see that different in instincts, but it's also sort of following up on this very line of, "That's your uncle speaking. Don't get involved. Don't argue. Don't." So thank you, Beatrice, and wonderful. So there's our avoider. Who are our cooperators? And here I want to introduce a character. Or first, anybody, can you think of any really cooperative characters in Star Wars? Again, cooperation gets in the way of all the lightsabers flashing.
Yeah.
So it's not stress, but there's a lot of cooperation in Star Wars. Heck, there's a whole Rebel Alliance built on cooperation. And
Yoda? No?
yeah, Isabel,
Maître Yoda?
Master Yoda,
Yeah.
absolutely. He tends to pull things together and pull people together
Mhm.
rather than fight. We go 5 entire movies without seeing him draw a lightsaber. It's pretty remarkable. Jedis draw their lightsaber. I mean, if I had a lightsaber, I'd draw it at the drop of a hat. Right? And yes, Master Yoda, we see him both in the way that he engages, particularly with Luke and with Obi-Wan in the early movies. And then as we see him working with other members of the Jedi Council in episodes 1, 2, and 3, there's something very cooperative about his moves. He doesn't try to impose himself. Cheryl, other cooperative?
No,
characters?
I mean that's a great example. I think I know who's coming next, and I want to talk about.
Because I don't know if because I hid this one from you. I just put it in.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's
Well, I love a surprise.
So my next character is Finn. Do you agree?
Finn starts out as a little bit of a avoider, but he definitely he has a strong cooperative streak to him.
And that's one of the coolest thing is, people do all sorts of things, and it's easy to say, well, he avoided there or he fought there. So what is he really? And when we look at people in the room, in the mediation room, we'll often find them, let's say, arguing, and it will be easy to categorize them on the spot as competitive. And it takes more thoughtfulness and seeing people over time. And that's why I said 10 minutes and not in a heartbeat.
Right.
Because it takes longer to understand that some behaviors are more intentional behaviors, and some are the instinctive behavior itself. And sometimes they cover up for each other. And my suggestion is that Finn, those who have only seen the earlier movies don't know Finn. Finn appears first in episode 7 in the newer movies that started coming out in 2015. He is a stormtrooper, and he leaves stormtrooper duty and he defects. He tries to abandon being a stormtrooper, and there's only one way out of being a stormtrooper, and that's on a stretcher. They don't let you go. So he has to run away from his stormtrooper role. Here we see him meeting Rey, who we later meet as a Force sensitive and later a Jedi. And from the moment he meets her, and even before that, we start to see that he's a very cooperative person. He always works with partners. This is a moment at which he naturally, in a moment of danger, he takes Rey's hand physically so that they can escape together. And she's a bit of a loner. She doesn't understand what he's doing. Right? Why do you keep taking my hand? And he, by nature, always takes other people's hands. Would you agree that on a
no, and she actually gets kind of offended, like, stop
Right.
taking my hand, stop grabbing onto me. I think it's a good example, sort of taking it back to first principles again. I go back to the grid, right? The relationship part is often hard to see when you're talking about a cooperative person, because cooperative people can initially present as competitive because they're usually talking about what it is they want, right? So they start the conversation with, here's what I think we should do, right? And it's not until they
hear or invite the other party into the conversation, that they can get a grasp on what the other person wants, so they can start to build that alliance, right? So I think when we get to the Star Wars piece, it's easy to see the heroes, all the members of the Rebel Alliance, as competitors, because they're very focused on what it is they want. But it's in their conversations with the others around them that they find the common ground, and they realize that we are all sort of stronger together. And the fact that they're not only willing to, but seem to have that, back to that instinct idea, that instinct to work together, to cooperate and to collaborate is what makes them different ultimately than the people we see who are with the Empire or on the dark side, who are equally competitive but have no interest in anybody else, right? And that's that to me is often the separation.
And you know, I just sort of piggybacking off what you said, our mediation rooms, we like to think that they're set up in order to be zones of cooperation, right? But at least our process sets people up to be initially competitive.
Correct.
There's no way around that. The moment we say to people, tell us what brought you here, or tell us your side of the story. So they don't say, well, I like to cooperate, so I'm here to work with them. They rarely open up and say that. Instead, they'll say their side of the story, how the other injured them and what the other owes them. That's 9 times out of 10.
Yep.
And that's sort of structural, and we do that because that's our process. And not everybody, but mainly. And so learning to recognize between sort of structurally imposed ways that people present themselves, and then as a next step, recognizing that people might be different than that. And then as a third step, learning how to help people transition from that presentation into other approaches is key for everything we try to do in the room. And Finn is a great example of that. And I'll give a demonstration of that, because Finn, just as Cheryl opened up, Finn doesn't always cooperate. There's this scene where he's they're trying to enlist him to join the rebellion and help the resistance and against the First Order, who is like the Empire on steroids, the new bad guys. And Finn, instead of getting on the horse and saying, yes, of course, I will lead you to, Finja says, we're out of here. Like, let's get out of here. You can't fight them. We need to get out of here. And here's a moment where, the audience might be thinking, what kind of either a coward or just a natural avoider Finn is. But that's not the thing. Instead, what's happening is Finn is a natural cooperator. He wants to join with this group of people to work things out. But he knows strategically he's done a calculation that's led him to believe that we can't win here, even together. And therefore, we all need to run together. Notice even his language is not, I'm out of here. His language is, we all need to run. This is our best move collectively, cooperatively. We all need to run. So even in his avoidance, there's like a strategic, his strategic avoidance comes from that instinct of, we still need to look out for each other. And it's that issue of moving from our natural orientation in conflict to our strategic thinking that I just want to spend a few last minutes talking on, and then final comments from anyone who wants to give us. Because in the mediation room, this is what we ask people to do so often. People walk in with their instincts, and sometimes they're structurally competitive stories or they're instinctively competitive stories. And one thing we need to do as mediators is we remind them, listen, there is more than one way to engage in conflict. Sure, you might be competitive instinctively, but there are all these other things you can do. Avoiders can compete. Sometimes that's constructive. Competitors can cooperate. That's often constructive. Sometimes the right thing to do is not to deal with the conflict now, is to strategically avoid. But how do you move from your instinct to working strategically with these sort of 4 approaches? These 4 instincts can be 4 strategies. The difference is that an instinct is something you do on autopilot, and a strategy is something you do intentionally. So in order to do that, I'd like to show a clip. It's a little speeded up and a little cut up because otherwise it would take about 10 minutes of film. But I want to show you a scene perhaps the most iconic scene in Star Wars. And many of you, or all of you, have seen it. It's a scene that's taking place in Cloud City. Darth Vader has lured Luke Skywalker to Cloud City, and he's trying to capture Luke. He's trying to capture him because he knows that Luke has the potential to be a very powerful Jedi, and he wants to turn him to the dark side and use him as an asset for the dark side, instead of his continuing to be an asset for the rebellion. So, and in doing so, Darth Vader gives us what I consider to be a masterclass in interest-based negotiation. And some of you might be saying, wait, what? Because we just gave Darth Vader as an example of the most competitive, instinctive person in Star Wars. And that's right. But then he reaches Cloud City and he wants Luke to work with him. And so he gives us a lesson in interest-based negotiation. Could you tell me if you're able to hear this?
Discover your power. I will complete your training. With our combined strength, we can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy. I'll never join you. I am your father. Join me. Together, we can rule the galaxy as father and son. Come with me.
Yeah.
Every time I see that, I remember myself as a 7-year-old kid saying, what? He's his father? Oh my God. And it was only like, 30 years later that I noticed really different things happening in that scene. And I'm wondering, Vader had Luke on the ropes. He could have killed him, or he could have, cut off his other hand and knocked him unconscious and froze him in carbonite and brought him to the Emperor. And then he starts talking instead. Why? What is he doing there? Cheryl, anyone?
I think you know my opinion. I want to hear from other people. I think your question in the chat's the right one. What was he trying to appeal to in Luke? Like what was his end, not just his end goal, like what was he trying to influence in Luke's inner being? Surely someone's got something to say about this. Solving the conflict in what way? Which conflict? I think the big global conflict, or
well, yes, not the one between himself and Darth Vader, but the overarching destroying the world conflict.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. He was sort of appealing to his what he knew was Luke's good side, and having been a Jedi prior to being a Sith, he could understand that, right? He really knew who he was speaking to, because Luke wanted to be this good person. And if I can appeal to the better angels of his nature, because effectively, and it's a rewind in their world and a fast forward in ours, this is the exact same appeal that effectively the Emperor Palpatine makes to a younger Anakin Skywalker. Look, you want to bring peace and order and justice to the galaxy. It's the Jedi that are corrupt. I'm the good guy here, right? And Darth's kind of doing the same thing here to Luke. It's a winning argument. What else? I've always wondered why it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
What was it inside of Luke that went, no, I don't think so. Let me throw myself into this bottomless pit.
Right, right. Which is an interesting way that we don't advise parties take when they're
exactly.
But here's the thing. Vader didn't know Luke's interests. He's just like parties in our room. He didn't know Luke's interest. What is he doing here? He's guessing.
Mind
He's guessing. We do that so often. We guess sort of based on what we know about these parties, what might their interests be in, and sometimes we don't know very much about them. So we sort of impose general or generic interests on them. Some, like, all companies want to improve their bottom line, right? So that, we know that. That's a general interest. All companies want to preserve a good reputation. So we assume that that's an interest that these parties have in the room. Sometimes we're right. Often we're right, but we're not always right. And I think that one interest that Vader imposed on Luke is the notion that Luke was looking for a father, right? That Luke wanted a family or affiliation. He didn't know that. He doesn't know Luke so well. So far, they've only met while shooting each other in fighters, right? They haven't really met each other. But he assumes, for what the little he knows about Luke, that Luke might be looking for a father. He knows that Obi-Wan Kenobi isn't around to be his father figure anymore because Darth Vader has recently dispatched Obi-Wan Kenobi. So here he is suddenly offering him this familial affiliation. What else? What other interests of Luke did he speak to there? What else did he guess at?
Well, I want to speak to the guessing just for a second too, to some of my mental health family systems trained colleagues. This problem of mind reading. We see this, and it's a big problem in anytime we're talking about therapy from a therapeutic perspective. It's one of the biggest sources of relationship conflict, whether that's spousal conflict or partner conflict or parent-child conflict. We're around someone so often that we assume we know things about them. It's really our version of them that we've built inside of our heads. And so much of sort of miscommunication and familial conflict comes from that. It's something that we have to help, something we can help people sort of overcome just through things like reframing and stuff like that. And this is not that conversation, this is a Star Wars conversation, but this is a great example of how that happens, about how getting it wrong in this instance, this Darth thinks he knows, right? Luke might think he knows things about Darth Vader, which we see in the next movie. He keeps saying all these things that he thinks Darth believes too. He's also then engaging in the mind reading behavior. It becomes persuasion. He's getting it initially, but anyway.
And as it comes closer to some of the mediation rooms that many of you have described yourself as seeing, we see this often between business partners. Right, business partners can be married couples, just
yes.
Whether they're married couples or not. So in business partners, and also in kind of tightly knit business relationships, even when they're not the same business. So in B2B relationships, if you've been working with someone in partnership mode for often, you think you're able to mind read them, and whoa, sometimes that really blows up in your face. So you throw things at the wall that you think the other thing, I don't know if Darth Vader thought he was reading the mind or if he was just throwing all of the possible interests. He knows he's killed Obi-Wan, so maybe Luke is looking for a teacher, right? I will complete your training. So he throws that. And what he failed to realize, this is to Cheryl's question, my take on it anyway, is that he fails to realize that Luke in the meanwhile has, he's found other affiliation and he's found other meaning in his life. He's found a group of friends who he's treating as family already by this point. And he's not looking necessarily for a father. He didn't know that he had a father until this moment. And suddenly it turns out the father is the worst thing you can imagine. The father is the monster. So it's
funny because you're actually pointing to something that happens very often. We take decisions based on gut feeling. And I just last Friday I gave a masterclass to a program on PPP professionals, and maybe I can quickly share the slide. It makes more sense then. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So
we'll see it.
So 90% of decisions are made on the basis of gut feeling, and only 10% on the basis of reason. And that's exactly what you're describing here.
Yep.
And it's scary because very
Yeah.
often we don't see the bottom side of the iceberg, right? We just see what's on the surface, and that's the assumption that Darth Vader has taken, and then it goes in a completely different direction. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and you know,
absolutely.
as mediators, sometimes like the one primary purpose we can serve in a room
Mm.
is help bringing that up from 10% to 11%. Right?
Mm.
Of course, we get lost in our own gut instincts and all of that as well. But if we're just a little more self-aware than parties, and just once in a process or twice in a process, we're able to recognize when things are instinct-based gut reactions,
Mm.
where a strategic and thoughtful move, and we can highlight that for a moment.
Mm.
That's where we can bring all of our value. I'm sure that everyone in this room has not just one more story to tell about how they did that, but 100, because sometimes that's all it is.
True.
Cheryl, you want to?
No, I'm interested to see if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts. Has this connected with you? Maybe not around Star Wars, but other things. I just love hearing people's reactions to this crazy idea, this crazy journey we've been on the last few years.
Maybe everybody can come on screen.
Yeah, everybody jump on. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's do a round table and everybody says if this relates to their own experiences.
Well, I must say I loved it. I was quite skeptical when Jean-Christophe brought up the idea. I thought, oh, interesting idea, but yeah, Star Wars, I've watched it, but I was very skeptical, but I loved it. It was really very well done. And I know we are running out of time, but I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour or so, and it would have been equally interesting. So thanks a lot. It was really a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, we know that being skeptical it's part of the deal here.
Right.
We totally get that. We would have been skeptical ourselves in another way.
I think first of all, I have to watch the movies again because it was a bit far.
There you go.
But it's a very good idea to review, and maybe next time as you say, it could be any kind of film, and just have this type of characters, and it's a very good idea, and to keep that in mind when you're in the room with the people. And I really agree with you when you say, well, we tend to project our thought on the other people, like the father, and in fact, very often we're wrong. So
Yeah,
that's I really agree with that too. It's been fun, but really I need to watch the Star Wars series again.
Well,
It's about when people say to me that aren't you worried that Disney is going to come after you, like that Lucasfilm will come after you for trademark issues? As I say, we are, so many people say things just like you said. Some say, I've never watched the movies, now everybody's so excited, now I need to go see the movies. Or say, I don't remember that thing, I'm going through.
No, don't worry about that. It's all for educational purposes only.
That's I'm not worried.
Yeah. No problem. And we can review another movie with this regards.
Yeah.
This this
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think that you can. I mean, it doesn't just have to be sci-fi and fantasy movies. I mean, there's so many films or books that you can make these kind of connections with, and I find that for the same reason this works. If you've got a good analogy, something that somebody's seen, a TV show or whatever, and you get them to talk about that, they're much more likely to be able to talk about something difficult than if you just addressed it head on, right? So you can have a really difficult conversation with somebody about something they saw on an episode of Seinfeld than actually talking about the exact same thing in their lives. And so the humor analogies, these are great tools for us because no one wants to talk about these hard issues really head on.
So my take-home message tonight is there's more than one way to engage in conflict. And I really liked how you showed us how you sometimes move from instinct to strategy in, you know, a movie that is so well known around the globe that to you it's now evident, but I think we'll all start to look at things with that lens now. So I think you've really opened up also our, at least you captured my attention to these things. And I'd like to really thank Professor Noam and Professor Cheryl for having shared their insights with us. Maybe a last word from you, Noam and Cheryl, before we wrap up.
I'm so grateful to have been a part of your evening today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to us talk a little bit of nonsense and a little bit of sense, hopefully.
Exactly that. Exactly that. It took, for all the skeptics who came, thank you. And
Thank
for
you.
being with us
Thank
and
you very
thinking
much.
this lovely. I hope, you know, tis the season.
Yes.
Have a lovely holiday season. And I hope your year goes so well.